Okay, so in the last section, we learned that when we write a component out, just the word, or just the variable, this is a class of a component right here. So it's just a type. It produces instances. To make an instance, we just have to wrap it with JSX tags, and that'll make an instance of our component. So not too bad, pretty straightforward. General rule of thumb, whenever we try to make use of a component, just wrap it in JSX tags and we're good to go. We still have an error message though. It says target container is not a DOM element. So let's look back at our index.jsx file. Let's read over our current code and compare the comment that we have above it. So we've got this first comment up here. It says create a new component. This component should produce some HTML. So yeah, it looks like we are making a component and we are returning some JSX, which gets turned into HTML by React. And then secondly, we have take this component's generate HTML. So that's here's the component and put it in the DOM. Put it on the page. So that second step here is what we're really missing. We're saying put it onto the page, but we're not actually telling React where to put the component on the page, right? The target container is not a DOM element. In other words, okay, React is saying, yeah, I'm trying to render this, but I have no idea where to render it to. So we can fix this really easily. React DOM just takes a second argument here. And that second argument is a reference to an existing DOM node on the page. So you can think of this as like a target container or a target DOM node. It says, hey, when you render this component, app, I want you to render it, produce some HTML, and then insert that HTML into this, we'll put it in here in a second, this element that already exists in our HTML document. So that means that we need a existing HTML node to render this to. So I'm going to open up index.html. And inside of here, you'll notice that we have this very top level div with class container. So this actually looks like, you might guess, this is a really good location to render our component to. In most React apps, you're going to see something that looks just like this. You'll have, maybe your body tag, and then generally you're going to have a div with something like class container or class app or, class something, maybe even ID something. And that div, or whatever element it ends up being, it's usually a div, is the root node of the entire React application. So as we start to write more and more components, and we've got say 20 or 30 different components being rendered on the screen at any given time, they all end up being a child of, or nested inside of, this very root container element. So let's flip back over to our render statement here, and all we have to do is pass a reference to that container. So we'll say document.querySelector.container. So this will say, okay, go find that div with class container, then try to render the app component into that div. All right, so let's save this, flip back over, refresh, and well, hot dog. We got hi on the screen. That was one heck of a lot of work just to get hi on the screen, but hopefully we learned something along the way. So we'll do a review of what's going on here, but there's one last little change I want to make. Notice how right now our component is looking like, just a normal function. We call it, return some JSX, we're good to go. Pretty straightforward here. So I want to take this opportunity to introduce a new piece of syntax, a piece of ES6 syntax. I'm going to drop the function keyword, just delete it, and then after it, I'm going to put a space, and I'm going to write what looks like an arrow. And we call this a fat arrow. This equals, and then a greater than symbol. So this code is nearly identical to what we had before. It's still a function. It's just a different way of declaring a function using new ES6 syntax. So this is still a function right here. Beyond the difference in syntax, there's also the only difference between this and using the function keyword is the value of this. So like JavaScript, this is slightly different inside of the function, but we'll talk more about that later on. You're going to end up seeing the fat arrow like this in place of function all over the place in React. In React, we sometimes need to create several functions inside of a single component, and so it really helps to have a more terse, a more compact syntax for defining a function. So for now, just remember that, more or less, except for the value of this, and we'll talk about that later, using a fat arrow like this is identical to using the function keyword. Okay, so again, you're probably thinking this is like the most work I've ever had to do to, get hello world basically up on the screen. I know. Nonetheless, it's really important to me that you understand the reasons behind the code we write. I don't like just tossing code up on the screen and saying, okay, hey, look, stuff popped up on the screen. It's only by kind of having a little bit of challenge there, talking about the code that we're writing, do you really get to understand the concepts. So, by figuring out the why behind React and Redux, you're really going to have an easier time in the future of solving issues that come up in your own projects. So now that we have a component on the screen, let's continue in the next section.